Better films. My brother has always had a dream of being a great filmmaker. For as long as I can remember, it's been his obsession. He got a video camera for his 8th birthday, and he would literally film everything with it. Even the most mundane things. He would have us do interviews for the camera and make little movies for himself. I thought it was cute at first. I mean, I really did. I would always help him with whatever little project he was doing at the time. As time went on though, something started to change. I can't really say what made him the way he was, but he became increasingly arrogant, increasingly difficult. Our parents definitely spoiled him. They spent a small fortune making sure he got the education he needed, just to pursue his dream of becoming a director. They paid for any expensive equipment he needed, for making and editing his own movies. They even helped pay the salaries of his crew and actors he hired for a short film. Maybe it was that made him so arrogant and mean-spirited. But increasingly, he became that worst kind of cliche, the artist obsessed with their vision and treating everyone else in their lives like shit. The self-centered petulant child in an adult's body. I'd like to say that I called him out on any of this, but the sad fact is, I went right along with it. It started in his teens. Verbal abuse and the occasional slap anytime I didn't do something right or quickly enough just for his liking. I should have stood up to him. I should have told him to get lost, but I found myself completely under his thumb, unable to say no or simply get him out of my life. To be honest, looking back, I can see just how unhealthy the whole thing was. Now, before you go getting the wrong idea, there was never anything incestuous here. My brother was just a bully, a fucking piece of shit, a little tyrant who enjoyed bossing people around, and I ended up becoming his personal servant, basically. He would belittle me in everything I thought, said, or tried to do. Anytime I would try to build myself up, he would tear me down and make me feel like I couldn't accomplish anything on my own. That I couldn't even survive out there without him. I should have known better, I guess, but when we were so young, it just became a part of me, and I genuinely came to believe the things he said. A part of me was too scared of trying to make it out there in the big, wide world all by myself. So much that I put up with my brother's constant bullying and taunting and increasingly shrill, angry demands just because I was scared of being alone, being cut off from the only family that I had left. Our parents had passed away by this point, and we had no contact with the rest of the family. Without my brother, I would be all by myself. His overbearing presence in my life had prevented me from making any real friends. And, the thought of trying to build a life for myself, by myself, was just a thought that terrified me. So, I did like I was told to do. He would say, "Joan, go get me coffee," and I'd fucking drive all the way across town to the one Starbucks that he liked and get him coffee. He'd say he needed extras, and I'd devote weeks of my life to arranging and carrying out interviews. He'd demand some sort of special piece of expensive equipment, and I'd spend however much it cost to get it. This was my life now. My brother's fucking PA and maid. The subject of my brother's short films and mini documentaries, they'd become increasingly dark and surreal over the years. He would create short, strange, and frightening little pieces, designed only to scare or unsettle you. Or sometimes there were ones that were just so bizarre, they were so utterly devoid of plot, logic, or reason, that it was impossible to tell what, if anything, he was trying to achieve or convey with them. His documentaries were pretty much the same. He would either film about gang crime, serial killers, and rapes, or else just create these disjointed scenes. One time, he filmed a dog, starving and injured on the street for a few hours. He just filmed it, struggling to move, to breathe. He just filmed the dog's pain. Some nights when I would go down to get a glass of water, I would see him there just sat in the lounge in the dark, watching these movies that he made, just staring at the screen. And then one day, he told me about an idea, the idea for his newest film and what it was going to be about. It turned out that he had begun to hear stories of an urban legend in the film industry. It wasn't something that was widely talked about or acknowledged, and the people who did talk about it always seemed to do so with a certain nervousness and paranoia, as if they were afraid of mentioning it, that it was dangerous or something. It was called Better Films. Supposedly, it was a studio or some individual who made incredibly weird films. None of the people we talked to who would admit to having watched a Better Films production would go into any kind of detail about what was on the tapes. And the films were only available on VHS, from what we understood. But all of them seemed incredibly disturbed by what they had seen. One person had even gone so far as to remove anything from their homes that could play video or audio. A guy who runs a small DVD and video store told us that he met with some of the representatives of Better Films just once. It was a pair of men dressed in red suits. He described them as being mutilated and claimed that one had been missing an eye and an ear, and the other man was minus a hand and a nose, and that the scarring around these wounds looked ugly and raw. They had given him a business card with nothing on it except for the logo, a childish cartoon-like drawing of a frowning face, and a tagline, "Making better films for a better audience," along with a website address where they said he could purchase their titles for his store if he wished to help support independent art. He checked it out, expecting some kind of artsy foreign stuff in black and white. He instead found a site full of strange and confusing clips that just kind of left him scratching his head, and that provided no clear way to order anything. He said the whole webpage appeared to be in Japanese. But even still, yet a week later, a black bin bag showed up on his front doorstep of his shop, and inside the bag were several tapes, all of them with the Better Films logo on their labels. We asked him if he still had any of the tapes, and my brother in particular was very, very insistent that we get to watch them. The man refused, and my brother offered him increasingly large amounts of money to buy or borrow one of the tapes. Finally, the man just held his finger up to my brother's lips before speaking. "Now you listen to me, and you listen, good boy. I've seen your type. I know that look you got in your eye right now. I get a lot of weirdos in here browsing the adult section, asking me if I got anything stronger. I know what you're after, and I know what you're thinking. So I'm going to tell you this, and I'm going to tell you this once, and then you're going to get the fuck out of my store. What's on those tapes ain't no little thrill for some gorehound trying to find himself a real snuff movie. What's on those tapes isn't anything like what you're imagining. What's on those tapes is worse. And I ain't selling or renting them to no one, especially not some little fucking half-wit pervert with more money than sense." My brother stormed out in a rage with me following close behind. As I left the store, the owner called out to me. I turned around to see him looking at me. An expression of genuine concern was on his face. "You want my advice? You stay away from him. The things he's looking into, you don't want nothing to do with." Well, I suppose I should have taken his advice, but by this point I doubt there was anything that could convince me to abandon my brother. So great was his hold over me. And so I continued to assist him as he dug deeper and deeper into the mystery of Better Films. We did manage to piece a few things together. The earliest encounter anyone seemed to have with their work seemed to be somewhere in the mid-60s. One person we spoke to claimed to have just known someone who had been in a movie for them in the mid-70s. A porn star who had gotten hired right off of the set of a film and had gone missing for almost 7 months. He had come back with a lot of cash and a hell of a lot of bad dreams. Another said that the company went back even further, that there was something called Better Productions, back before there were really even silent films. She said her mother had told her stories that she had heard from her grandmother, who had heard them from her grandmother, about some spooky boogeyman stuff about some performer named Elizabeth Walker. We even found someone who claimed to have grown up watching a Better Films TV show. She said that it was called Sunshine Street, and that she went on and on about how strange it had been, how she always remembered the logo, and how it was the first thing that came to mind when she heard the name. She said it was always creeping her out, the way the frown would kind of curve into the smile at the end of each episode. The animation looked eerie. Well, that's how she described it. And then, one day, my brother came home with a woman who claimed to have been a producer who worked at Better Films. I was dumbfounded. For all the work we had put into this, I hadn't expected us to get anywhere. To be honest, I was pretty much convinced that the whole thing was just some, ghost story. That if there ever had been a Better Films, there was nothing more to it than some low-budget production company that had made a few creepy little flicks and then folded up. All the weirdness around it, all the little hints and dark suggestions that we had gotten about there being some real sinister, more terrible thing behind it, I had just chalked it all up to people making stuff up. Or, at the very least, people having heard stories about Better Films from unreliable sources, and then passing that along. But here was someone who claimed to work for the company in the flesh. She introduced herself as Miss Kismet. Her hair was a bright red, almost certainly dyed. I can't believe that any hair could be naturally as bright as hers looked. She dressed in a red suit, and like the men our friend at the video store described, she looked as though someone had gone way out of their way to mutilate her. One eye was missing, as was her nose. 3 fingers were missing on her right hand as well. I tried not to stare, but by the look of all these, they had been done so crudely, so violently that it made me wince. Her and my brother spoke at length for some time. I wasn't allowed to listen in or partake in whatever they were discussing. But after a while, they stepped out of the lounge, and my brother asked to speak with me alone for a minute. He told me that he had convinced the woman to actually let him come to the filming of one of the Better Films movies, and to meet with the director responsible for their work, to actually interview people who worked at the highest levels of production at this company, and to get the real story as to what they did. However, to secure this, he had to offer the woman a form of payment, as he said. And that payment was her getting to spend a night with me, where I would do anything that she wished. I could have slapped him. I wanted to hit him, but instead, I just yelled. I told him that it was too much, that he wasn't gonna sell me off like some personal property like a slave. He shrugged. He didn't seem to care about my anger, my hurt. It's not that big of a deal anyway. You like women, right? You'll probably enjoy it. Don't worry, she promised that she won't hurt you at all. His tone was cold, emotionless. It was clear that he couldn't care less whether I'd be hurt or not. He couldn't care less about what this person who he knew nothing about wanted to do to me. He didn't give a damn about my well-being or my safety. But it was clear that I was just another tool for him to make his goddamn fucking movies. Oh well, that makes it perfectly okay then. And while you're selling me off to this total stranger, did it occur to you to ask what I thought about it? My opinion on whether or not I would want to spend a night with some woman who, for all we know, makes a hobby out of making snuff movies? He stared at me for a few moments. His expression was totally unreadable. And then, slowly, he spoke. If you don't like it, then of course I can't force you to do it. You can say no. You can refuse. Just like I can refuse to let you live here with me. Just like I can refuse to support you financially anymore. But you know what? Don't worry. I'm sure there's plenty of opportunities for some ugly, witless little talentless thing who barely made it through high school with no real skills or even likable qualities. I'm sure the local burger joint is absolutely desperate for someone to mop their floor or clean up their grease trap. And who knows, maybe after a year or two, you'll be able to afford some place that barely has any roaches or rodents in it. It's not like anyone could stand you long enough to come visit, so it really doesn't matter what it looks like. You'll be living out your sad, lonely life in it alone. I felt like I would cry. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, to go to hell. I wanted to storm out of there and never talk to him again. But part of me kept telling me that he was right. That I was everything he said I was. A loser. An idiot. An idiot without any skills or good qualities about me. A pathetic, stupid child who would never survive without him. I felt like garbage. Like dirt. I felt the way that he always made me feel. For as long as I could remember now, and I just meekly mumbled that I would do it. That I would agree to spend the night with Miss Kismet. We met at a motel. A real sleazy looking place at the edge of town. She had sorted out the room for the night and told me to come alone. Just with one of my brother's cameras. I was terrified. More and more as I walked to the room where she told me to come to. Terrified of what she might do to me. Of what could happen. If she killed me, my brother would probably just help her hide the body. I knocked and I heard a familiar voice telling me to come inside. The room was pitch black as I entered. It was almost impossible to see. I could make out Miss Kismet sat on the chair beside the bed. There was a knife on the table beside her. I had never been more scared, more utterly terrified for my life than I was in that moment. "Sit on the bed and start filming," she said. My legs were shaking. I somehow managed to make myself walk over and do what she had asked. Sitting down and swinging the camera up to film her. I began to ask what she wanted me to do, what she wanted me to film. She just told me to keep the camera rolling and not to stop until she instructed me to do so. Nothing else. She whistled loudly, and from the bathroom a dog came limping out. It looked like it hadn't been fed in a few days, thin and pretty unhealthy looking. I watched as Miss Kismet picked up the knife from the table, and she began to slice lines into her own hand. My jaw dropped as I watched, as I filmed. She cut deeply into her own flesh. Blood began to pour from the wound. She lowered her hand down to the starving animal, and allowed it to lap up the blood now trickling from the fresh cuts. After a while, she would withdraw her hand and repeat the process, cutting into her hand, and then her arm, slicing deep wounds into her skin and letting the dog drink her blood. I felt ill. Worse was the look on her face as she did it. That ridiculous grin that never changed. Never left. She kept that horrible forced smile on her face, no matter how much or how deeply she cut herself. Looking like something out of a fucking nightmare. Sat there in the dark, smiling that awful fucking smile. Finally, she put the knife down. She reached into the drawer where she set the knife down and pulled out a pair of scissors. As I watched her, she placed the little finger of her right hand in between them, and slowly, she closed the blades around that digit. Do you know what it sounds like? The crunch of bone as a finger is severed by a pair of scissors? Well, I do now. I could feel the vomit rising in my throat as slowly as she cut the finger off. The grin was still fixed on her face as she cut through the flesh and bone. It fell to the floor and the dog pounced on it. And then, finally, she told me that I could stop filming. I was shaking. I felt ill. I felt worse than I expected to feel. I didn't know what this was or why she asked me to do this, and frankly, I didn't want to know. And then suddenly her arm shot out, grabbing me by the leg. She pushed her face mere inches away from mine. The grin was now gone, replaced with this look of pure terror. The worst kind of fear I had ever seen in another person's face, ever. Her eye darted from side to side. Her body shook. I could feel the blood from her fresh injury soaking into my clothing. Help me. The words were so desperate, Spoken as if it actually caused her pain to say them, coming out as a broken, pathetic whimper. For the love of God, please. She's gonna kill us all. Don't you understand? She's gonna kill us all. And then she stopped. Her words cutting off, a little squeak of pain came from her as if someone had grabbed her by the throat. Then I realized we weren't alone in that room. Stood in the dark, in the corner of the room was another woman. She was dressed in a tuxedo, with a featureless white latex mask over her face. There were no eye holes in the mask, and yet, somehow, as she stood there, motionless in the dark, it felt like she was looking at us. It felt like she could see us, could see me. That she was studying me intently, watching me very closely. I felt more afraid than I did before. That motionless woman in the white mask stood silently in the blackness. It made my heart pound. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I had to get out of there. I had to get out of that room. I got up and I ran out of the room, ran down the stairs, out into the parking lot. I didn't even bother getting in my car. I just ran into the street and away from that motel. Away from Mrs. Kismet. And away from that woman in the white mask. It was the next day that Miss Kismet showed up at my brother's home. She was all smiles once again, and thanked me for my time. My brother asked no questions about what happened, most likely because he didn't care. He could care less. And he was happy to hear that Miss Kismet would now arrange a meeting with him with the director, at the set of their current production that they were working on now. Miss Kismet made it quite clear that this invitation, it was for my brother only. And you know what? That suited him just fine. He told me to stay at the house and work on editing the footage that we had put together so far, and said he'd be back as soon as possible, with the interviews with the director and actors involved in Better Film's newest movie. He was beaming, clearly happy that he had gotten his way, that now he could get to finish his movie with actual footage, real footage of what Better Films did. As much as I hated him, in every way I wanted to tell him not to go. In a way I was actually scared for him, worried about what might happen. He was a bastard, but he was also my brother. But I kept my mouth shut and let him go off with Miss Kismet, waiting for his return. And I waited. And waited. After it had been several hours, I started to worry. When he hadn't returned at the day's end, I called the police. They told me I had to wait at least a day to file a missing persons report. They told me not to worry, and that most people show up long before that time had passed. My brother, he didn't. And so I went to the cops. I told them about him and the films we had been working on. I told them about Miss Kismet. I described her to them and told them about Better Films, which they reacted to skeptically. I can't say that I blame them. I told them about the woman in the white mask, and they looked at me like I was crazy or something, like I was making it up. Again, I can't really hold it against them. The whole thing was so bizarre and unsettling that I don't know that I would even believe it if someone told me about it. They told me that they would look into it, said that they would be in touch if they made any developments in the case, anything that they managed to turn up. They told me not to worry about my brother. They were certain that he would be fine. The longer I waited without news, the less I was worried, though. The less I cared about him at all. Finally free of his bullying, his endless taunts and insults, I found myself becoming more confident, more assured. I began to go out. I began to talk to people, to actually start to make friends. I even met a girl at this bar not too far from my brother's house who I started to see as more than friends. I started sorting out job interviews. I started feeling good about myself, looking in the mirror and not feeling like crap for once. I felt happy, actually happy, for the first time in a long time. I felt like I had worth and value, and that I could make it on my own. A package showed up a few months ago. It had no stamp, no address, and nothing written on it. It was just a brown package left on the doorstep of my brother's house. I opened it up and I found a video cassette inside, with a label on it that said simply, "We make documentaries too." I was worried now, nervous yet curious at the same time, not wanting to know what was on the tape and needing to know at the same time. I walked over to the TV and slid the tape into the VCR my brother still owned, and that I never bothered to throw out since he had gone missing. It began to play. It was footage of us going around to talk to people about better films. Footage of us going into that video store where we met the man who claimed to have seen Better Films movies. Footage of us going into the homes of the people who we'd interviewed about this. Footage of us walking down the street to and from places. On several occasions, it zoomed in on my brother. Whoever was behind the camera seemed to focus on him. I stared at it, a chill running through me. How long had they been filming us for? How long had they been following us, watching our every move? How long had they known about us before Ms. Kismet met with my brother? The tape went to static for a few seconds. I thought it was over, but I was wrong. Red light spilled onto the screen as the picture returned, bringing with it an agonized chorus of screams and howls of agony. On the screen was my brother. He was suspended by what looked like hooks, rusty metal hooks, his body hanging from them in a veritable maze of razor wire. The wire found its way around his body, cutting into his flesh, seeming to move like metal snakes. Whoever was manipulating the wire was off screen, but their effects were very clear. He was missing a hand, a leg, his ears. His mouth was wide open. Screams were all around. The source of them wasn't visible, but you could hear what sounded like dozens of voices all screaming with pain, howling and shrieking in agony. His eyes were wide, terrified, his body jerking and twitching as he screamed the same words over and over and over again. The same two words. "Help me." I stood there staring at the scene for a moment. My brother was trapped, somewhere, in what appeared to be a private hell on earth, having God knows what else done to him by these people for reasons I would probably never know. I walked over to the set, turned off the tape, unplugged the VCR and the TV, and knowing that I would never mention this tape to anyone, I whispered a few words to myself. No, I won't. And I burned the tape. To this day, my brother had never been found. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of the patrons listed on screen right now: Dan R., Paul Z, Cody V, Chaos X, Mr. Swiston, Official Jerboa, JY Pyromancer, Hayden MH, Ethan A, Dark Side of the Bear, Daniel H, and Maximilian Charles P. Thank you guys so much. You keep this channel alive.